Where was I? You may have heard the saying, ignorance is bliss. For about 4-ish years, ignorance was bliss, or at the very least, a degree of contentment and absence of grief, or at least the grief that I would know later. I was a very hard-headed young man, and all of the promises and aspirations that I'd had up until around the age of 18, 19, I just assumed that they would happen somehow. I hadn't really twigged that anything has or was changing. I remember, I think it was around 18, 19, they kicked me out of the last youth group that I'd been involved in. And I was saying to myself, well, if that's not the group of people God expected me to be with and to change the world with, then there's another group of people out there, and somehow, some way, God will still make it happen. And such was my get up and get back on the horse attitude. You remember that I'd spent some time previously praying for a very sick woman with her cancer, who tragically died in spite of a brief moment when we were seeing some positive signs. And I actually found another young man. A lot changed in the years after 18. I got my driving license. It made me a lot more independent, but I'll get into that later. I started driving to see this young ex-pastor, and he was an ex-pastor because he'd had to retire. He'd been a very enthusiastic, very much loved and respected young man who had planted a church in his local area, got it going, and then had to retire because of, well, take time off because of this health issue. And of course, I was Old Ladies Network, which knew everything and everyone, so it seemed, in the spheres of Christendom in the area. And I found out about this, and with my whole new phase of independence, you'd be amazed how much independence a mobile phone and a car gives to a young man. If I'd have had a mobile phone and a car when I was 16, my life would probably have been quite different. Anyway, I got in touch with this young man. I managed to get a phone number, and I said, look, I don't want to seem like a weirdo, but you're a pastor, you believe in the power of prayer. I believe in the power of prayer. I would very much like to come and pray for you. And so I did go and pray for this young man, and I started going to pray for him regularly, once every month or two, roughly. And tragically, he died. It took quite a long time. There wasn't any real breakthrough or turnaround. It was just a slow decline. Um, the skin cancer in his leg spread. It had already spread, otherwise he would have chopped it off. But it kept spreading, and they kept treating it with chemotherapy, and eventually it just overwhelmed him. And obviously, it's a real tragedy. He had a daughter and a wife and a church he needed to lead, really, and all of these things to live for. But alas, it wasn't to be. And I didn't know what to make of it. It made me sick to my stomach. I didn't really know. Like, I was desperate to see the power of God and to see that we could actually win one for a change. But the point I'm making is that I did get back up on the horse. I just carried on with the momentum I had. I just carried on with the momentum I had on my own. And I was actually mostly pretty upbeat. I mean, I was grieved, over the loss of these friends, over the loss of these groups that I thought had so much potential. I was grieved over the wasted potential for so many things, but I didn't feel like it was a dead end at that point. I was expecting things to carry on, for new opportunities to open up. I was expecting something to come over horizon any moment. And that was very much my attitude towards work, of course, because if you remember, I failed my A-level computing course, but I always wanted to be I would have said I wanted to be in the ministry anyway, and by in the ministry, I don't mean running a church. I mean doing work in the community for Christ. Detached work, they sometimes call it. Community outreach, that sort of thing. And obviously, I desperately wanted to do it here in my city, not somewhere else. If I'd have been part of a C of E, I could have gone down the ordination route, but that would probably have led towards, again, running a church and would almost certainly have involved me moved about because that's what they do. And I wasn't in the C of E. I wasn't in any of those systemic churches with kind of rules and organizations of overarching committees that have programs that you can just sign up for and, well, apply for. And the charismatic church, it's really who you know. Whether or not you can get involved in that sort of thing depends very much on whether or not they see any point in spending any money on you if they think you need to be a permanent member of staff to do it, and also whether or not they just like your face and think you're a good egg. And I did not have the connections because, as you know, I just left a church that subsequently imploded. It kicked its pastor out, spun off its youth group into a separate organization, and then imploded after a year or two and ceased to be. And I ended up at another smaller church. Well, no, it was small, but not that small. It was about the same size. But perhaps it was a prosperity gospel church, and not in a bad way, not in a kind of you nab it, clam it, and we'll take all your money. At least certainly not in the early days. It was a kind of like it was very, very strong on teaching on faith for personal finances, faith for personal healing as well, which I was all for. And in fairness, as I could say, all for. And in fairness, as I could say, the pastor seemed to have a real passion for the church and a real love of scripture, a very strong kind of emphasis on Bible teaching. Um, and this particular church was something my parents had started going to, and as things started to deteriorate, I started going to. Didn't really make any friends there. As I said, I was around 18, 19 at this time. All of the people there my age were either young professionals or young couples. I actually ended up hanging around with the kids. There weren't really a lot of teenagers, like 16, 17-year olds. And to the extent that there were, they didn't really want to hang around with me, and I don't blame them to that, but there weren't really. It was more kind of couples in their 19, 20, 21s who would have been my natural kind of people to reach out to, when they were all very serious, boring sorts, if you don't mind me saying so. Or at least that's how it seemed to me. With a handful of maybe exceptions who I didn't warm up to me or I didn't warm up to them. It was mostly a church full of middle-aged and elderly individuals, but with a great emphasis on faith and Bible teaching, and at that time also works. I loved getting involved in their weekly soup kitchen. I felt that was exactly the kind of thing I ought to be involved in. I was just frustrated that we couldn't do more and reach out more because obviously we could only reach the people who would come in. But I would sit on tables and I would discuss the personal life issues of people who were prostitutes and drug addicts and like this is, I would just sit there unobtrusively and be friendly and listen to what they had to say and listen to their problems and be like, "Can I pray with you? Can I help you? Can I advise you? Can I at least sympathize with you?" You know? And I really felt that that was a meaningful step for me. That felt like part of what I wanted to do, but unfortunately, it kind of wound down and it struggled quite a lot. For starters, we moved building once, twice, thrice again. Um, and the people who ran it, there was some argument. The people who had really been passionate about the homeless project, there was a bit of an argument among the leadership at one point, and they left, and then some other people took over, and they tried to make it a bit more preachy, and that put some people off. There was a bit of aggro. It continued for a while, but it wasn't super consistent and regular. And then I think it kind of petered out as other people who were involved in leading it kind of left. It's a great shame. That church was a good place, though. It's where I preached my first ever sermon. I preached two sermons there: Ruach, life, and the prerequisites for biblical revival. I was still big into revival. I was still pursuing that old chestnut. But there was no path into ministry for me there. At least it didn't feel like there was. And things went down some odd routes. So after a year of trying to support myself, I assumed, well, no, I didn't assume, I tried to become self employed. I tried to start up a tutoring business because I did very, very, very well in mathematics. I thought I understood mathematics enough to teach it to others. I had helped others during my A level, and I felt confident that I could teach at least at GCSE level. So I opened a tutoring business, had cards in all the newsagents in the area because this was before the days when advertising was done on the internet so much. And I had my little mobile phone number on there, and people would ring me, and I would get calls randomly throughout the day, and they were always something on the lines of, "We're not really interested in maths tuition, but do you do English tuition?" And the answer was no, I didn't. This dyslexic person who struggles with English does not do English tuition, unsurprisingly. So I never got a single client. And it wasn't for lack of exposure. It wasn't for lack of awareness because clearly people were seeing the adverts. It just wasn't in demand. Well, I suppose if I'd had more people seeing the adverts, I'd have found some who did want help with maths. But so after about a year of pottering around, my poor old parents were like, "This can't go on. You're just tossing on our sofa. You're not making any money. You're not doing anything. You don't have the grades to get into uni. You need to go back to education." And I'm like, I can't really argue anymore. I couldn't. And anyway, what they were suggesting was so limited a fraction of my time that it didn't seem to be a big commitment. They'd figured out that if you paid a certain amount of money, you could attend university as an external student to do just a handful of modules. So, an average university course is 120 credits of modules a year. And a typical module might be somewhere between 10 and 20 credits, depending on. Um, And so I did 4 modules, I think accruing 40 credits. I did over the course of a year. I did Engineering Mathematics 2, which was a second year course. I don't know how my mum persuaded them to let me do a second year course, but she did. I did I did cryptography. Again, that was a first year course. The guy who ran the cryptography course was actually a retired naval intelligence officer, and he really took a shine to me and said, I think you should be on the fourth year master's course of cryptography. But unfortunately, I turned up on the day the fourth year master's course of cryptography was meant to start, and it was cancelled because the economics students who were taking it found it too mathematically challenging. Instead, they'd replaced it with a stock market analysis course, which they considered to be much easier. And I sat through the first lecture of this in confusement, when one of the economics students stood up and said, "But what's a sine wave?" And the lecturer then proceeded to spend 5 minutes explaining sine waves to fourth year economics students. How? So I don't have a very strong opinion of economists, I'm afraid. Um, I also did 2 modules of ancient Hebrew, semester 1 and 2. So that got me enough credits to get into university, except we screwed up because we didn't know that I needed GCSE English to get into university as a prerequisite. We just saw kind of AAB or whatever it was for the entrance requirement. Me parents hadn't dug into it, and since I had no enthusiasm for it, I hadn't dug into it. Um, So we didn't know I needed a GCSE English, and we only found out when we were doing the application. So I had to spend another year doing a GCSE English course. So I had 2 years of kind of thumb twiddling, where I was just doing maybe what 4 or 5 hours of course a week, something like that. I mean, no, it'd be more than that. It would be something like 7 hours of course a week, and I got good marks in everything. I got a GCSE English in the end. It wasn't mind-breakingly hard. Um, but it did mean that I was spending 3 years kind of twiddling my thumbs, and I was 21 before I actually would get into university. Um, so that kind of delays a lot of things and pushes a lot of schedules backward. Involved in a lot of things to keep me busy. My mother had a dance teacher and a makeup artist, the same person, move into our attic and offered her free, well, not necessarily free, but offered her a bedroom. And she wanted to do kind of missionary work in the local area and had a real passion to do kind of creative dance. And she set up a series of dance lessons in a local school, after school club kind of thing, dragged me into it and said, "You're going to help me teach dance. I'm going to have you stand up on stage and you're going to parrot my movements and you're going to be involved in teaching dance." And then she bought a couple of DJ decks and says, "You need to learn how to DJ." And like, oh, okay then. So I learned how to DJ on these DJ decks so that I could do the backing music and the breakdancing music and that sort of thing for them to do their dancing. And yeah, it was tough for me because I didn't really feel included, but at the same time, I learnt a lot of good dance moves. People have always said my dancing is actually pretty good for someone who, at one point, didn't used to think of themselves as being super coordinated. I briefly dallied with martial arts now that my parents couldn't complain. I started taking effectively Tai Chi lessons, but only for like 4 or 5 weeks because they cancelled it. It was a taster session, and I don't think there was enough demand for them to turn it into a regular class. Yeah, all kinds of things happened. I started exerting a little bit of independence. I could go places and do things on my own in the car because I no longer needed mummy and daddy's permission. I no longer needed to try and navigate the bus timetables because you have to understand this was in the era before smartphones. If I needed to do a bus journey, I needed to get out multiple bus timetables on paper, work out, remember to leave on time. And I was very forgetful and very bad at remembering to leave on time and go on places on time until I had a PDA, a personal desktop assistant, which is a little Palm Pilot computer. Until I had one of them, I was forever missing appointments. I was just very, very bad at it. So there were a handful of kind of local things in the local area that I was involved in. And I am going to have to end this stream early because I am getting a phone call. Apologies.